What's up YouTube, how you doing? Adam here, and in this video I'm going to be talking to you about Aperture. Now when you want to get yourself into manual mode, which is hopefully what we're kind of trying to help you guys do, there's really three main ingredients that go towards correctly exposing your picture. One of those is ISO, which we did a previous video on, and I'll put a link to that up here. The second one is shutter speed, and again I've done a video on that and I'll put the link in the description as well. And the third and final one, and I think the most important one, is the aperture. Now the reason that I think aperture is more important than the other two is really because not only does it actually control the light that comes into the image to get it correctly exposed, but it also controls the way that the image or the video looks and feels. Now the reason for that is because aperture directly relates to the depth of field that you're going to get in your image or your video. And the depth of field is the kind of blurriness that you usually see either behind or in front of the subject that you're taking the image of or the video of. And as a lot of you have seen, if you've got a subject in the foreground and you've got a wide aperture, when you take a picture of that subject, it really does make it stand out in the picture because the background is blurred out, and therefore really making the subject stand out in the photo and giving a really nice effect. Now aperture is actually measured in something called f-stops. Now they usually range from something like 1.4 or 1.8 all the way up to something like f16 or f22, and they can vary slightly at either end of that scale. Now as the f-stop increases in number, the aperture gets smaller. As the f-stop decreases in number, the aperture gets wider. Now I'll show you a close-up of this on the screen, and essentially what the aperture is the opening and closing of the iris inside the lens itself. The lower the f-stop number, the wider opening of the aperture or the iris inside the lens, and the higher the f-stop number, the smaller that opening gets and the iris closes right the way down. Now in terms of light exposure, what this means is that the lower the f-stop, the wider the aperture, the more light is going to be let into the picture because the iris is much wider open. As you go up through the f-stops and the aperture gets smaller, the less light is going to be coming in because the hole is smaller, and therefore you're going to require more light to correctly expose the picture. Another relationship to aperture is the wider the aperture, the lower the f-stop number, the more depth of field you're going to get. So the more blurry background or the more blurry foreground, depending on where you're focusing. As you go down through the numbers, you're going to get a lot more depth of field, and as you go up through the numbers, you're going to notice that a lot more things are in focus than they usually are when you're at a lower f-stop. Now what I'm going to do to actually show you this is we're going to use this Blue Yeti microphone here as a subject, because that's basically all I've got, and we're going to take some images and we're going to start off at 1.8 and we're going to go all the way up to f16, which is what this particular lens is capable of doing. Now this is the Nikon 50mm 1.8, so this is a prime lens and it has a very large aperture of 1.8. Now a good thing about having a large aperture is the fact that you need less light, therefore a faster shutter speed to get the correct exposure. The higher your f-stop goes in terms of your lens, that means you're going to be requiring more light, slower shutter speed, or more ISO to correctly expose the image or the video. Now to give you an idea of the way that that looks, I'm going to take some pictures here of this Blue Yeti microphone, and we'll see as we go up through the f-stop numbers and the aperture closes, more things will be in focus, but then we'll have to adjust the shutter speed or the ISO to make sure that we get the correct exposure, and you guys can get a good feel for exactly what aperture does. Now one thing I'd recommend that you do after this video is grab your camera, stick it into aperture priority or manual mode, and do exactly the same as what I've done, so you can get a feel yourselves for how aperture affects the picture. So I've got this in manual mode, and what we're going to do is we're going to start off with an aperture of 1.8, which is the widest that this particular one can go, and then we're going to grab a picture here of the Blue Yeti microphone. Now I've got to set the shutter speed correctly so we get the correct exposure. I'm going to focus in on that, and bang, there's our image. And now looking at this image, you can see that the background is completely out of focus, and it really does bring the subject nicely to the foreground. You can barely make out what is going on in the background. Now what we're going to do is we're going to bump the aperture up to f2.8 and we're going to take another image again, adjusting our shutter speed as we go to get the correct exposure. And there we go. Now the background is coming slightly more into focus in this particular image. Now what we're going to do is we're going to bump this up to f4 and we're going to take the same image again, making sure to adjust our shutter speed to get the correct exposure. And there we go. And again, you can see in this image, the background is coming more and more into focus as we go up through the f-stops and the aperture gets smaller. Now again, let's go up to f8 and we'll take the same image again, adjusting our shutter speed correctly. And there we go again. And now you can kind of get a feel for what's going on in the background because it's showing up a lot more. You can see my video camera there that's recording us, and you can also kind of see through the window that there's a little bit of fence outside as well. So now let's bump the aperture up to f13 and take the same image again. And this time the background really is almost completely in focus. So what we're going to do is we're going to do one more and we're going to bump this right the way up to the maximum of this particular lens, which is f16. And now pretty much everything should be almost in focus. And there we go. And now you can make out some of the kind of finer detail that you've got in the background with the video camera, the image of me on the LCD screen, and also the fence outside and the sort of blue boarding that's in the background. Anyway guys, that's pretty much how it looks. Like I say, what you need to do is go out, get your camera out and go and try these things out for yourself and see how the actual changing of the aperture affects the picture and how you have to adjust either the ISO or the shutter speed to keep the correct exposure. Now one more thing I wanted to mention is the actual f-stops themselves and how that is calculated. And if you've got an aperture, for example, of 1.8, that means that the aperture, the size of the iris opening, is 1.8 times smaller than the lens itself. If you've got an aperture of 16, that means that the opening is 16 times smaller than the lens itself. So that gives you an idea of how you actually calculate that. Anyway guys, thanks very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, subscribe for more and I will see you all in the next one. See ya.